Says we're live.
Okay.
Um,
I'll take your word for it.
yeah. Hi, everybody on YouTube and watching live or on the recording. My name is Nick Cho here in San Francisco, California. It is 4:30 in the afternoon on this Saturday, the 21st of March. And I have as my guest my friend and colleague, and sometimes we like to call him the Papa Smurf of specialty coffee, Rick Rhinehart. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good. How do you introduce yourselves these days?
Just Rick. It's an amazing thing if you think about the sort of perpetual question about how people identify, and like most men of my age, I would have said that in spite of my best efforts to identify first as a father and second as a husband and finally as my role in the work world, inside the core of my mind, most of the time, and certainly in a setting like this, I would have identified as my role in the work world. So the last few months have certainly been good at resetting that and identifying. So I tend to think of myself as Wendy's husband first and foremost, and then my kid's dad, and then sort of just this guy hanging out, observing the world.
This guy hanging out. So, well, Rick's played a few different roles in the specialty coffee industry and continues to. And most recently, I guess, until this past year, was it executive director? I don't know what titles are, but it's the Specialty Coffee Association and Specialty Coffee Association of America before that. Yeah. What the hell's going on, Rick? Can you explain what's going on in the world? Because I don't think anyone else can explain what's going on in the world. Maybe you have some insight.
I have exactly as much information available to me as everybody else who's got an internet connection. I don't know any more than anybody else does. It's funny though. About 3 weeks ago, I was sort of wondering about what it all means, and coincidentally, my aunt is an epidemiologist, and I like to say, she literally wrote the book on infectious disease and quarantine in home care and hospice. And I mean, she actually wrote that book, and that book is a textbook for people who study these things. So I thought, hey, I've got this great resource. So I called my aunt about 3 weeks ago to say, hey, what should I know? What should I be thinking about?
Hold on a second. Why is this not working? Is anyone on there right now? Can you leave a comment? I see that it says it's live, but then I logged in on here and it's not on. Let's see what is the matter. Ooh.
Is there any commentary coming through that?
Someone says, I see you. That's Trish on my iPad in front of the room. Someone says, I see you. Okay, it is working. Never mind. There's just something else that wasn't working. Sorry about that.
No trouble?
Yeah. Where were we?
I'm sure I was rambling on about something. In any event, I don't know a whole lot, Nick. I certainly don't know any more than anybody else on anything having to do with how we got here or where we're going. I do know, I can tell you what I'm doing personally, which is trying to keep my wife from going out in the world and trying to make sure that my 90-year-old mother is doing a reasonable job of self-quarantining, and then just trying to be a good citizen and ordering coffee from small coffee roasters all over the country, and trying to keep our local markets going.
Thanks for that.
Those things. Thank you. I've got coffee, which makes me ahead of some people out there. So.
Yeah, I mean, here in San Francisco, we're trying to keep our shops going. This is something we can talk about, which is the choice to keep going versus what a lot of places have done, which is close. this is definitely one of those moments where I wanted to get you and maybe do again the series of chats, just because I think that I know a lot of what's always motivated me in the coffee industry in terms of the community is, what do I need? Like, what are the feelings that I'm having, and the awareness that other people might be having similar feelings or corresponding feelings depending on what's going on with them, and that if all this is going on in this situation, it's like, well, I appreciate the conversations I've been able to have with folks, and part of it's sharing, part of it's connecting, and part of it is just like, it's like mental exercise. It's like, when we talk about industry stuff, it's like getting your brain going in this direction that feels like it could be constructive or positive or hopeful or optimistic or something, or, reality check, and just like, maybe it's not something that's not necessarily positive, but that, yeah, and so we've been staying open, and we're actually doing kind of okay. We can talk about some of those details and such. I wanted to talk to you about some of the stuff you've been writing about and some of the stuff that you've been thinking about writing regarding, this COVID-19 crisis, and how what thoughts you've been having about the state of the industry and that stuff going forward. So why don't we start with that a little bit? Is like, how do you? We can talk about personal stuff. We can talk about kind of microeconomic level things. But one of the things that you've always been really good at is being able to tie together that sort of micro macro view to give a good overview on where we're at, where we've been, where we're going. Yeah, and so with that and like the stuff you've written recently, like what are your thoughts lately?
Well, I mean, listen, any reasonable person, the first thought you have is that this is uncertainty is the order of the day. So none of us knows with any clarity where this is going at any level. I mean, so that level of uncertainty drives volatility and drives lots of kinds of reactions. So we can step back from the uncertainty just for a moment and say, well, what remains reasonably certain throughout that? I get back to the perspective that I voiced to someone today, that coffee is not going to go away. I mean, we're going to keep drinking coffee. So all the things that make us want to drink coffee will likely persist. And you can already see at the sort of micro level the same sort of shift that happened in 2008, 2009 in the economic recession, that coffee consumption remained relatively unchanged. It was the point of consumption that changed principally. So people kept drinking more or less the same amount of coffee they were drinking, but where they drank it shifted fairly significantly. Obviously, cafes and restaurants, out-of-home consumption were the big losers there. In-home consumption gained.
It's interesting though, because obviously, like I opened my East Coast Murky coffee shop in Washington D.C. in 2002, so we were open through that whole period. We didn't see a drop during that period, and for me, it was mainly because maybe there was, again, on a macro level, or for other channels of coffee retail or whatever. But '07, '08 was also kind of the third wave, finding our voice, getting our legs, sort of era as well. And so, one of the words that's sometimes overused, but I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I think that is appropriate for that period too, is like differentiation. We were differentiated in that market enough to where we didn't notice much of a hit, because the people who were coming to us were already, they're a self-selecting group, right? They're already a little bit affluent. They're willing to spend a little bit more on coffee, and maybe even like a little bit less willing to give it up, and had the resources to be able to make that choice in that way.
Yeah, I think your story's not that unusual. Although I would say the period in which out of home consumption really got hit was relatively short-lived for the top end of specialty, particularly in those demographics that you just described. So 2008, 2009, the end of 2008 and most of 2009, out-of-home consumption went down a lot. In-home consumption rose. But gourmet out-of-home consumption went right back. By 2010, it was back to the 2006-7 levels.
Interesting.
And I say that not because I'm a wealth of information. I just happened to have looked at that data this morning because Ashley asked me about that.
Uh-huh.
So I
Shout out
chased it down.
Ashley
Yep.
Rodriguez out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So having said that, what's fundamentally different here is that in most parts of California, there's a more or less a ban on going out. So if you haven't made the conversion to, as you moved really quickly and were nimble and made the conversion to takeaway, and a few others have done that. People like my friend Paul Thornton up in Oregon, he's always been a walk-up stand, so he just put a sign out that said walk-up only, and nothing changed from day to day. But for most people, they're really feeling that impact. They're not having the traffic, the kind of sit down, walk in traffic. And there's, on top of that, for people who are roasters and have a cafe business and a wholesale business, their principal wholesale customers are either cafes or restaurants, both of whom are feeling the same pain. So it's going to be a big leap to shift to filling the in-home consumption gap for the small roaster retailer. It's going to be, I suspect, much worse for the non-roasting cafes who don't have any of that sort of wholesale business to keep them going, and who have all the challenges of trying to shift their business to a to-go business, if you will.
Well, that's interesting because here's sort of how this has affected us, or in sort of what we've observed here. So a few things. Number one, and this is some of the stuff I talked about on Twitter, but getting into it here. There's for a coffee company, for a roasting retailer, there's wholesale that is selling to cafes, to restaurants, to grocery. Grocery is busy as hell right now. All of our grocery accounts at Wrecking Ball are like 2-3 times the volume that they were before. Then there's direct to consumer, mail order coffee, right? And so that everyone is saying that there's been a jump, and on the most part anyway, and that's great. I don't know how many roasting companies are out there for whom the economics work, where mail order is enough to really sustain the business, especially as most of the wholesale has dropped off. And then there's retail cafes. And, this is something that we talk about when I talk to new cafe owners or talk to like real estate agents that talk about like retail spaces. But I remember years ago, an older gentleman who's much more experienced in this sort of stuff telling me, like, there are 3 things that human beings do. They work, they live, and they play. And when you're talking about locations in any given market, any given city, you want to be where all 3 things are occurring at once. And you think about that, and whoever's watching, when you think about your respective cities, like, when I was in Washington, D.C., I was thinking about that, and I thought, like, oh shit, there's like 2 neighborhoods that all 3 things are like thriving and really occurring. Here in San Francisco, there's a lot more of that. It sort of makes San Francisco like a kind of higher in stature in that way than Washington, D.C. Places like New York City, all 3 things are happening on top of each other in a lot of the city, except for, of course, the sort of financial corridors. So taking that idea and thinking about how it relates to what's going on right now, I mean, you look at the areas where it's primarily entertainment districts or primarily like office, downtown financial areas, dead. Nothing happening. Almost every cafe that's located in a location like that has had to close. And what's left, of course, is where people live. And not just, obviously, if we're talking about cafes, we're not talking about literally inside of residential only areas. There has to be some retail component to it, either mixed use or like a retail corridor within a residential area. And that's where we are for our 2 cafes. The one in Berkeley, the newer one that we've had since August, as well as the San Francisco Cow Hollow one. In residential areas, we've stayed open, and we're kind of doing okay. We did make some quick sort of nimble shifts in our service, trying to stay ahead of stuff as much as possible. But So far, so good. I do think that this, call it like differentiation or bifurcation or whatever, in terms of the places that could feasibly stay open if they set things up in the right way versus the places that there's just no chance. Yeah, it's there. I haven't seen any conversations yet talking about the difference between those two categories, and what constitutes like you actually have something to fight for versus like throw in the towel and then we'll regroup later after all this shit is over.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing if you want to talk about the macroeconomic side of this. I'm sort of struck by the revelation for everybody instantly in the coffee business, in the cafe business in particular, is that, wow, we really only have two real expenses that aren't directly associated and irrevocably associated to the level of business. So the cost of goods and all those parts of things, if you don't have any business, your cost of goods goes to zero,
Right.
theoretically. But you're struck very quickly that what can you play with? And you have labor, which is, you can see the clear and the devastating impacts when people go, hey, I want to cut labor because I don't. And then the other one is the occupancy expense. And I'm sort of fascinated, if you really want to step back and go, what does this all mean and what's the potential for change in all this? We have in our current system this belief that rent-seeking activity has more inherent rights than labor activity does. So it's nothing for a company to say, oh, we laid businesses, we're closed for business or we're down in business, so wham, we laid everybody off. So everybody is imminently flexible, not our problem. You're laid off, good luck, have a nice day. And if you're a really enlightened company, you went, we're going to keep paying you, but this makes us good and enlightened and interesting. What's interesting to me is what's happening on the other side of that, on the rent seeking side of that. So you've got a couple of landlords there, and we see little bits and pieces out in the world where landlords are contacting their tenants and saying, hey, I know you're in this, we can defer. It's a great question about the nature of capitalism. And if you think about it, capital is applied to different things. One of the things that we principally see capital applied to is the ownership of other things that generate revenue. So rent-seeking activity, owning a building or a house or whatever that land, whatever it is that allows you to generate rents. And it could be material, it could be equipment and lots of other things.
Right.
And we've had a sense, because we put, and forgive me for this, but we have really put property rights ahead of human rights in the last 50 years across this country.
Yeah.
It lets us settle into the idea of most companies would lay off their staff before they would call their landlord and say, hey, I need a rent abatement or deferral for the next 6 months or for as long as this lasts. I need you to not be pressing me for rent. Now, and I'm not, I should, with utter clarity, I also have a rental property. I have tenants who live in my old house, and they have not called me and said, hey, we need a rent abatement. As far as I know, in conversation with them, they're still working and things are fine. But I have had to have that conversation and sit down and go, what would it mean for us if our tenants couldn't pay their rent, and we want, we're humans, so we want to accommodate that. But then I had to think, what's in the other direction? Could I call the mortgage holder on that property and say, hey, I need a rent deferral, I need a rent abatement? And how is the whole country going to think about that in this coming weeks and months? And how are we going to look at the sort of tenets of capitalism that we exercise unconsciously in our day-to-day lives? Again, I don't know how many people who have cafes immediately called their landlords and said, hey, I can't pay the rent this month, or called their utility company and said, I'm not going to be able to pay my power bill this month. But I do know that almost everybody called their staff together and said, I can only pay you for 5 more days or 5 more weeks or whatever that number is, and then I'm out.
Right.
And what is it that makes that sense of priority, which it seems to me as a human being, absolutely the wrong order of priority? Why is it that that's what we think of as the natural and appropriate order of priority?
Well, I think there's the obvious thing, which is you have a lease Whereas there's no, if you don't have an employment contract, you don't have an employment contract. It's an at-will employment in most circumstances, right?
Sure, but I mean, but stepping away, those are the rules
I'm not
of the
talking
game.
about
So
ethically or morally right. You
yeah,
understand where I'm
that's
coming from, yeah.
right, but that's the fundamental problem, isn't it? That we didn't, that conversation doesn't start from a ethical place. And yes, I have a friend who asked me one day, he says, "Why do you hate capitalism?" And I'm like, "Oh, I don't hate capitalism. I like capitalism mostly. It's just that I like it as a system of economics, not as an ethical system." And
Right,
I feel like in the last 50 years, we have really confused that idea of capitalism as a system of economics and as a system of ethics, where, if shareholder value is the most important thing in your system,
right,
whatever your system is, then, it defines how you ought to behave in a world. And if the thing that you're doing creates more shareholder value, then you ought to do it. That's
right,
an ethical system, and that's not okay with me. So
right. I mean, and then the other
that's
part of it, of course, with, you're talking about real estate versus employment or like labor, you're talking about an order of magnitude more dollars usually attached to it, which again, like kind of to your point, right? It's like you were putting price tags on things and prioritizing as a result, but that's our fucked up sort of like uber capitalistic culture that we live in. Um,
Well,
yeah,
if there's an imminent silver lining in this series of very, very dark clouds, that's one of them to me. Is the sort of the nature of the course of events will be to start to ask those questions sort of overtly and in polite society, and say the things out loud that maybe we haven't said out loud in the
yeah,
past for a whole variety of reasons. And I think they're good questions to ask, and they're the appropriate questions to ask. Is why did we all immediately think, I got to fire my best friend, but I got the I got to pay them. Really? That doesn't seem like the right sort of order of things.
no, it doesn't. It's interesting that you say that because I've never had that conversation with employees in terms of having to lay people off, at least not yet. And we've had situations where we probably, other people would have. It's not that the thought didn't cross our mind. We're thinking about everything. It's just that, we put that at the sort of the end in terms of the last resort, like truly last resort. And in the past few months, I have talked to landlords. In that's you have a fairy who just showed up. Is the only go talk to Tinkerbell over there? And for this right now, I mean, it's interesting that all this is really happening this week at the beginning of this week, and it's the middle of the month. So a lot of the conversations about rent and such that usually happen at the end or beginning of the month, I haven't had any conversations with landlords yet. We have 3 landlords. I have a pretty. I'm 60-70% sure that they're all going to let us either defer or just like not pay these months. But we'll see. Part of this, of course, is like it's a month-to-month situation. We don't know what's going to happen later.
Yeah.
We don't know how long this is going to go on for. I think that we have to be prepared for this maybe going as long as a year plus, potentially. I don't even like hearing myself say that, but it's a scary thing. Have you been? Let's shift gears a little bit. Have you heard at all for anything from the producer side yet this week?
Nothing super significant. The in general, we haven't seen a lot of cases in the places that we think of as the producing side of the equation.
Uh huh.
And some of the realities of at least at the farm level, the physical distance between people may have some potential benefits. But keep in mind, a significant portion of what we think of as the producing world, it's the middle of summer there. So some of this is quite subordinated to seasonal patterns in a lot of those localities. Brazil is the sort of the leader on the producing side in terms of the number of cases. I think I read 600 or 700 cases
Oh.
And in the densely populated areas of Brazil, I would presume this is going to move like crazy.
Hmm.
So that's kind of frightening to think about. So it's not so much the producers at the farm level that will be the first ones to feel the impact. So I think it's the intermediation, that consolidation and shipping, where we'll see the physical impacts of the virus spreading.
So
It's frightening stuff.
through the '08 financial crisis, I mean, aside from the the regular terrible situation when it comes to coffee producers and the C market and such, um, were there major impacts that were attributed directly to the financial crisis? And I mean, we already talked about consumption didn't necessarily change.
Yeah, there was probably. I mean, one of the things a number of things that happened in terms of the price of coffee. Coffee was in the upswing at that moment, so you'd had a huge downward price pressure crisis that had happened between 2001 and 2005. So coffee was starting to move back up,
Mm-hmm.
and the financial crisis had a couple of near-term impacts. One is that it sort of shifted some of the production away from um, what we would think of as specialty to more commercial markets, because the commercial markets were very alive and active and were taking on coffee. The less obvious thing that is definitely an impact of the financial crisis was the massive consolidation post crisis. And keep in mind that a lot of cash flooded into the market. The U.S. put however many $1 trillion or so into the economy, and the EU later did about the same thing.
Hmm.
So whatever quantitative easing provided there, a few trillion new dollars just showed up in the world economy,
Hmm.
and a lot of that money went towards clever people saying, "Oh, I can use this money as practically that money in ways clear and less clear to buy up means of production and companies and lots of other things." So a lot of the consolidation that happened in the sort of 2010 to 2018 cycle was driven by this sudden access to tremendous amounts of money at effectively zero interest or near zero interest rates. And
Hmm.
I don't know what happens in this scenario, where you've got a sort of a repeat of that, where the Fed is moving as fast as they can to make money available. It's the market has no idea how to process this yet. I mean, an example would be the mortgage market. When the Fed lowered the rate again to effectively zero,
Mm-hmm.
mortgage rates, 20-year, or actually 15-year fixed rates, got down about 2.25%. And then 2 days later, they bounced back up, not because the Fed raised the rates again, but because the influx of applicants for refinancing their mortgages was so high that the mortgage companies said, "Okay, we can raise rates again just to slow down the influx of applications a bit."
Right.
And so that's an indicator that the market's not making this kinds of perfect market decisions that we think the perfect market makes. There's all kinds of irrational or temporary decisions being made out there. And I can't tell on coffee yet. Coffee's been doing better than most commodities, and one of the things that's interesting is it's been decoupled from oil, which is
Hmm.
coffee doesn't follow oil perfectly, but it's usually got it's got some attachment to how oil moves
Right.
for a variety of reasons, and that has not been the case this time. So coffee's been improving a bit.
Through that financial crisis time, 12, 13 years ago, what was the state of like green coffee kind of brokers, like import exporters? I mean, we were saying that consumption was relatively stable. Not that there's a ton of green coffee importers and exporters who are going to be watching this, but it's just are what would you expect would happen to those folks? Would they be hit because of the sort of supply stream downstream in terms of roasters and cafes? Or is it going to be like that coffee is going to go somewhere because consumption is going to drive acquisition of that green coffee?
Yeah, I think people are going to continue to buy coffee. The where you buy the coffee is what changes, I
Mm.
suspect. So I don't think that's a big issue. In the last downturn, interestingly, I think it was a whole different game for the big traders at that point. One of the things that at that moment in time, things hadn't changed dramatically for the trade. So the traders made their money principally in commercial coffee. They had small in terms of margin, small margins, but a lot of transactions that added up to a fair amount of money. And so they made a nice living by pursuing those transactions. And then they all had a little bit of interest in specialty where the margins were better, but the volume was low. And so they did a little specialty because you sort of had to pay attention to that. And then the trade always sort of makes a little bit of money sort of speculating on their own accounts, in part because they can and they have some expertise, and the best of them don't ever get too exposed out there, but there's opportunities to make a little money there. In the current scenario, it's quite a bit different, in part because the margins in the commercial trade have been squeezed down to nothing. As part of that consolidation, all the big roasters became sort of traders for themselves. Mm-hmm. And basically what happened is the roasters hired traders off the trading desks on the import side, on the import-export side, made them their buyers, and they just squeezed all the margin out of the trade there. So you've got, and then you added into it this, hey, we'll pay you in 180 days or 360 days, or you start to add these things in, and suddenly the commercial trading for the coffee traders, it's not a very lucrative business. It's got lots and lots, maybe more risk than ever. It's increasingly difficult to lay off that risk, and the margins are razor thin. And if you looked, a lot of them just on wholesale went, hey, we should do something in specialty. And again, specialty margins are much, much better, but the work that goes into the specialty trade is, because it's a lot, shipping a container of coffee takes exactly as much paperwork as shipping 5 bags of coffee, and so suddenly you had to do a lot more work for somewhat better margins, and probably a lot more risk because the little guys are much more than the large companies. So I'd say at this moment, the trade is not in any more or less pain than they have been for the last 5 years, but they've been in a pretty fair amount of pain for the last 5 years.
Right. So, I mean, that's interesting. Like, so looking forward now, I mean, okay, so a bunch of cafes have had to close because people aren't going to work. And so the places, and they're not going to, like, again, entertainment areas, entertainment districts. And so those places are hurting or have closed. I mean, if it's just like normal arithmetic, right? So, like, if there's a shrinking of the number of retail establishments out there, but then consumption is going to stay pretty flat, then, we have an awkward situation where it's like, well, who's going to capitalize on this situation? Like, someone's going to come out, maybe not on top, but someone's going to come out, certain people are going to come out, certain companies are going to come out in better shape than others. So it's kind of wild to just think about that that's happening right now. Again, like, one of the conversations that happens around places that have closed is the whole question of, like, are they going to come back? And I've been saying, like, I think more places are going to come back than people think, because, I mean, here's some real talk stuff, right? So we're still open, but I'm helping run the show and coming up with a lot of ideas to help customers feel like this is a safe place. This is like a health conscious. Health conscious is the meaning has changed, right? So a place where you can come, feel pretty safe about your cafe sort of experience, because we've taken all these measures. Like, not only did we go to go only, like everyone else in California did, but we set up everything in the window so that people don't have to come inside, just giving people more room on the sidewalks to kind of spread out and do their social distancing. And then we put a sneeze guard, like a plexiglass sheet up, that then further made, that was most of these things are really about making the baristas feel safer. We made a thing where you take a little piece of wax paper and you wrap your finger before you touch the touch the touch screen on the cash register, so that, and all these things are things that people have really appreciated. What I've come to realize, and again, it wasn't my intention, but I was just focused on our shops and trying to like figure out what I could do, and then taking a step back after putting all that work in, realizing like, oh, we've just differentiated ourselves as like the only cafe in the neighborhood, if not the area, that are taking these measures, and therefore it's like it's a differentiation thing in the marketplace. Um, that feels a little awkward because again, like this isn't a time to be thinking necessarily about competition and stuff. But in the effort of thinking about survival, like these are the sorts of things that end up happening. What that's in turn made me think about a little bit is, this is the real talk part, right? The fact is that we're in a space now, like James Hoffman talked about this about London like years ago, that there's certain pockets of the world in urban centers where there's like legitimately market saturation of cafes, or too many cafes for this neighborhood for all the cafes to thrive. And for me, it's like hearing him talk about London in that way was interesting, like intellectually, but I couldn't relate because I wasn't seeing that around anywhere else that I could see. Maybe a little bit Seoul, Korea, a little bit different. But then a few weeks ago, I was in Washington, D.C., and talking to Ryan Jensen, who runs Peregrine Espresso over there. They had opened a cafe in a part of Washington, D.C., where there were no other specialty coffee shops around, and they were doing great. And since then, like 3 other shops have opened up within a 3-block radius. And they were preparing to close because they couldn't make the numbers work, because all the customers were kind of spread out among these different cafes, and the numbers weren't really working anymore. There wasn't enough sort of additional development, either residential or whatever. I'm touching my face. Residential or whatever, to be able to support that many cafes. I'm thinking about, again, this is sort of the morbid, kind of uncomfortable conversation, but let's have it. Like, there is this sort of term that is thrown around, the market correction, right? A market correction. Like, we've talked about this at Rico Symposium, in a lot of different ways. Like the idea of a market correction, whether it's like a bubble bursting or whatever, like something that happens fairly like a rapid market correction. So I'm just thinking about how, like in the specialty coffee story, especially in the third wave age, there are businesses and brands and individuals and people and personalities who have been the movers and shakers, on the business level as well as on the thought leadership and innovation sort of level. And that there's also a larger group, maybe the bulk of the industry, that is following the direction of where that tip of the spear goes, and kind of drafting behind the leaders in the industry. And, I won't name names, but, there's a lot of companies that I think a lot of people wouldn't think of in that way, but you and I might, and some of our friends might go, no, they're actually kind of like, have always been kind of hangers on, drafting behind some of the industry leaders, but then, kind of miraculously coming out ahead at the end because they've been able to focus on business as the others have been focusing on innovation and such. It's weird to see now, like most of those companies, not all, but a lot of the companies, especially here in the Bay Area, that were like that they were armed with a lot of money and not necessarily a lot of know-how, experience, or ingenuity. They're not really, they closed their cafes. Like they couldn't figure out how to make it work the way we did, the way a lot of other folks are. I've talked to the owners. I talked to Cog Glanville at Go Get 'Em Tiger, and G&B down in LA. I've talked to Eileen Hassey over here, Eileen Rinaldi here in San Francisco, Kevin Bolin at St. Frank. A bunch of people who are fighting to make it work for their companies, and these are all people who are have continued to be innovators and really leading, being leaders in their respective markets. And I don't know, like it makes me, I'm interested, to know your thoughts, of course, but like, it's just something I've been thinking about, like, in what ways is this going to be a market correction, depending on how long this goes on for and how long these cafes stay closed, once everything's over, people are joking about like, oh my God, the brunch I'm gonna have when this thing's over with all my friends, and just like, or all the makeout sessions, like all the games of spin the bottle I'm gonna have with all this like pent up, like, I can't touch anybody thing. Um, once this is all said and done, how do things come back in what way? And for that matter, like, what does the shakeup in our industry, like, how does that settle out? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't have a good enough crystal ball to know. I have a couple of thoughts. Interested. I had a conversation about exactly this earlier today. Um, and I think a couple of things. One is I think there's been a tremendous amount of inefficiency on the consuming side, on the cafe side of the business, and in many respects on the roasting side of the business, but definitely in the cafe side of the business. And those inefficiencies have been covered up by very low coffee pricing for a long time. So, being able to keep the cost of goods quite low, and frankly, we've had access to cheap labor in the U.S. for a long time. So the
Yeah.
combination of access to cheap labor and low cost of goods has allowed pretty inefficient coffee operations to go forward. I think it's been further complicated by something more on the social side of things, which is a change in expectations. So if you think back to the 90s when specialty really started to sort of emerge out there in the world, Starbucks had just gone public and everybody was out to start their cafe. One of the backdrop scenarios was you had a lot of people who were been in the corporate rat race for X number of years and were like, okay, I'm going to cash out my retirement and go do something that is more meaningful for my soul than writing marketing jingles or whatever.
Yeah.
But or they got their businesses closed up and they got a golden
I,
parachute.
I, I don't, I don't want to roll my eyes about those folks, but it's also like sort of cliche. It's like, I'm a lawyer. Like, we see them even now. It's like, I'm a lawyer and I
Yeah,
really want to get into specialty coffee because it seems like it'd be fun.
but those folks who got into the business at that time had a set of expectations and they had a certain sum of capital that they were willing to invest,
Hmm.
and so they went out and they spent 50 or 300, $400,000 to outfit a shop, and they drafted a business plan. They went to the bank for financing. They did all the things that you think about in small entrepreneurial businesses, and a lot of them failed because they just didn't understand what they were trying to do, and for a whole bunch of other reasons. But they had a set of expectations, and the ones who stayed in and were successful, their expectations were about return on investment, about growing their business, about what their exit strategy was going to be, and all these things. And they built these substantial businesses over time. The small cafe operator today, there's been a massive proliferation, at least as far as we can tell anecdotally, because I think the data is kind of weak still. But there's been a huge growth in very small cafes, non-roasting in particular, and those. I mean, the capital investment at point of entry is tiny, right? I mean, it's very, very small. People have been willing to get into spaces at very low cost of entry with a minimal amount of equipment, with a minimalist approach to changing the space. And for many, the expectation is, wow, if I could make enough money to pay myself, I'd be sort of happy. So the return on investment is not.
Yeah, be careful about these terms like tiny when you're talking about, at least $100,000 to get a place, like bare minimum, right?
Right, but that's relative to the sort
Yes.
of $350,000. I mean, even in your own experience, you compared what Murky was for you
Sure.
versus what Wrecking Ball One
Right.
was for Cal Holly was. I mean,
Yep.
and you are a wily guy who learned a lot in the Murky experience about how to minimize your cost and maximize your outcome
Right.
in Cal Hollow, but not everybody's had that joy. So there's a lot of people who are just sort of entering the business or have just entered the business. And so I presume a lot of them will leave the business with the same sort of thing. But the other backdrop to that is that what's the expectation? A lot of those folks are folks who went to college, got a degree in something, have not been, they were buffeted by the recession and were further hampered by the very slow reemergence between 2009 and 2015, and got a gig in coffee somewhere and said, hey, I could work this into having my own gig in coffee, and did. And that's a much different thing than than somebody who worked for 30 years for a marketing firm and had a $850,000 401k built up
Right.
that they decide to liquidate some of in order to or borrow against or whatever. So I don't know what the future looks like. I don't know how people are going to reemerge from this. I do know this, that the people making the design innovations for the new cafe after this is over are not going to be baby boomers and mostly not going to be Gen Xers. I think it's going to be a lot of folks who are 14 to 22 today. When this changes, when the reemergence happens, they're going to design a cafe or a way to consume coffee that's theirs and not something that they inherited from us. There's no doubt that there'll be a nostalgic desire. So you and me and lots of other people are going to have a nostalgia for the cafes that we knew, and there'll be a place for that. But I think you'll see a new paradigm begin to emerge. I don't know what that is, and
Why does there have to
just
be?
for one thing, it's a huge demographic bubble, and for the other thing is that this is a generationally defining event. This is not. This is
Sure, but
not
it's
a
not
little
like all of a
thing.
sudden like sandwiches are like I mean, it's not a good analogy, but you know what I mean. It's like coffee is coffee. The last sort of big changes in terms of the product of coffee that's offered to people, right? Is like there's like the espresso boom, that happened through the '90s and on, and then arguably like I mean I don't even know if you can count pour over and stuff. Like maybe like a single cup offering sort of thing. It's a much smaller market share. But since then, like I'm gonna pretend cold brew doesn't exist. No, like you
Yeah, I
can.
was going to say
But
you can't.
no, but the thing is, even that it's not. I don't think that cold brew is as big of a deal, and ultimately it's going to pan out as like not have been. It's going to be like the Zima of coffee. Like it was like a thing for a few years, and then everyone's like, remember that? And while they're sipping their flash brewed kind of thing. Um, I mean,
Maybe, although the data is against you on that one, in part because you got a whole bunch of people who came to coffee through cold brew, and the data suggests very strongly that your entry point into coffee is your destination as well. So if you started out being a drip coffee drinker, you're probably the rest of your life. And if you start out as an espresso drinker, you're likely an espresso drinker for the rest of your life. And it's way too early to tell, but if you started out as a cold brew coffee drinker, you may well be positioned to be a coffee drinker the rest of your life. And again, I can't say it's way too early for anybody to say on the cold brew, but it's definitely true on the other modes of consumption.
interesting.
Yeah.
We have a few people who are watching live. Does anyone have any
Wow.
questions for us? Any questions or things they want to talk about, or any topics that you want us to get into? I mean, we'll see about the cold brew thing. I'm not so sure, and it's not just because we don't kind of play in that particular swimming pool, so to speak. It seems like, if anything, the cold brew people are much less invested in what their product, like, and anecdotally, we're hearing a lot from folks with the cold brew companies and the cold brew brands that category, like that consumer, is a lot more fickle, and something new comes up and they'll try it, and then all of a sudden it's like, you know what I mean? There's constantly new entrants into that space, and there is something about an RTD, like ready to drink product, that lends itself to like, hey, what's the new thing? Yeah, whether it's beer or kombucha or like Coca-Cola and Pepsi are constantly coming out with new shit all the time. It's like
Yeah.
they have to keep the attention of that consumer base, but
I mean, one of the fundamental differences is that, when we think about the growth of specialty coffee, we think about it largely in the cafe terms, and there's a human interaction there. So your perception of the product is influenced to one degree or another by who presents the product to you and how they present it. So when somebody comes into a cafe, they have an interaction with a barista,
right.
good or bad, and that influences the outcome of that product experience. with the RTD products, it's not. You grab it off the shelf
It's
and
just
you
the
walk
brand.
off with it.
Right.
Right. So the outcome of that, by the way, is that there's a lot more money available to invest in the brand. You make the bottle prettier or the label prettier or a different shape or a different delivery mechanism or whatever it is. There's a lot of playing in that space with how can we catch a consumer's eye and
Right.
get them to take this and then walk off and feel like they've had a positive experience. That's a whole different world. And it's
Right.
not a world that either of us has really played
Yeah.
in.
It's funny, as we're talking about this cold brew thing, I'm watching the numbers on the viewer count going down. So, like, what? Anyway, like, we should wrap up. I mean, what are you? Do you any thoughts on the next week? Like, what's going to happen in the next few days? Anything going to change? What do you think? I have some thoughts.
Yeah, I have I mean, sort of I think at the policy level, I think there's going to be a continued drive to do something flashy. I don't know whether the right things will get done, but the headline grabbing things will get done, which will be interesting to watch what those are and how people's positioning changes in the politics of the moment versus the practical realities of the moment. I think the other interesting thing is that rational voices are going to say, hey, it's going to take anywhere from 10 to 20 days before you start to see the impacts of physical distancing in the social distancing sense to see how the curve is moving. Meantime, as testing ramps up and as the regular epidemic curve happens, we're going to see massive increases in the number of cases. And I'm going to be interested to see how well people maintain their sort of sense of reality about this. That big upward spike in cases, it's coming. And what we're doing right now may change the dimension of that increase and the duration of that increase. But we're not going to know it's going to be at least another 10 days before we can see whether there's any data feeding into that. And it's going to be skewed dramatically by the massive increase in testing that we're going to see. So don't lose heart. And if you're doing the right thing and you're maintaining that physical distance in social distancing and you're staying home and you're doing all the things that you're doing, don't think it's all for naught. I think it has to happen. And I'm hopeful that we're going to stay on that track. I don't have a lot of confidence in our ability as a society to exercise self-discipline, but the stakes are high.
Yeah. I mean, we are here in California. Actually, I'm in the Bay Area. You're in Southern California. Was it yesterday that the governor instituted the shelter in place for the whole state, or the day before? It was yesterday, right?
Day before. I think it was Thursday night.
It was day before. It was Thursday. So we've had a 2 or 3 day head start ahead of everyone, and for now at least, like this shelter in place order with the asterisk of don't go out except to do stuff you want to do. Don't go out except for like food, and then businesses have converted to go only. We're under this, and I don't know what the next sort of escalation of that is. I mean, they can't say don't get food. It just doesn't make any sense, right? So it is kind of that's a big question mark for me. It's like what's the next level if there's an escalation? Because for now, like this is pretty severe as it is. The analogy I've been using to talk to people about this is that like whenever the weather changes, and I don't mean rain, I mean like temperature. I notice a drop off in sales at the cafe for like a day or two. It's kind of like the whole community is like, what just happened? Hey, like what the fuck? Sometimes it's that school started and people aren't used to the new, if they have children, like they're not used to the new sort of life patterns yet of like taking them to school and things like that. But then about 2 or 3 days goes by and then people figure out, oh, okay, this is the new normal, to some degree, you could make the argument like when, for a lot of us, when Trump got elected, I see your shirt there. I don't see everything it says, but like, that it just feels for a moment like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And then you kind of, human beings are resilient in that way. And so here we definitely saw that for about 2 days, things dropped off a lot. But then, whereas while it didn't get back to normal for everyone, that we started to see people kind of poke their heads out of their respective homes and like, oh, like people are not, again, back to normal, but people are trying to go out, maintain social distance, and our customers have been surprisingly, they've been doing a great job of kind of keeping away from each other, but kind of checking each other out and venturing out, and so forever, however long this lasts, there is this kind of, again, this new context, this new landscape of what cafe life looks like. And I just, for anyone who's watching this, I just want to encourage you, like, we've taken some steps. We'll put the link in the comments below. As far as the blog post that I posted about the things that we did, they're working. The customers are actually really appreciative. They kind of act like we made the impossible. Their response to us is like they made the impossible. We made the impossible possible. Like that little magical little thing that just happened on your. What is that? Is it your doorbell?
That's my doorbell.
Oh, okay. But that, in this time when we're trying to differentiate and trying to survive and keep our stuff going, that there are ways of doing that. It's just that they've changed, and so, yeah, like let's be there for each other and trying to support each other. It's part of the reason I wanted to do these chats, is to put more ideas in more people's heads, whether it's just like kind of TED Talk style, like food for thought, or they're actionable things that you can take back to your company or your shop or your cafe or whatever. We didn't talk a lot about today, like about barista situations, like, what's going on with folks right now. Ashley Rodriguez over at Boss Barista has been crunching some numbers, and her estimates are that there have already been 150,000 baristas who've been laid off already. And I think my next chat that I want to have like this is going to be with Ashley and talking more from a barista centric, sort of coffee worker centric, point of view. But yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. So hang in there, everybody. Yeah. Well,
thanks for calling me up, Nick. Pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah. So it's been almost an hour. We'll try to keep these things about an hour, and keep in touch. And if there are more developments in the Rick world, we'll get you back on and have another chat soon.
All right, and give my daughter a big smile from across the room.
Most definitely. Okay. All right. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right, everyone. We'll see you next time. Like I said, we'll try to get Ashley or somebody else on for the next one. I don't know how often we'll do these, but let me know either via Twitter at Nick Cho or here in the comments. Who do you want to see? Do you want to come on and chat? Like, I'm pretty wide open. Though I'm running around trying to run these cafes, also there's some time to sit down and do this. And so I'd love to talk to you. All right. Peace. Be well, everyone.